I'm here today with Ian Mortimer, a renowned historian of medieval England who's written many, many books on figures such as Edward III, Henry IV, Henry V, as well as bestsellers like The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, The Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England. He's really a unique figure as a historian of the Middle Ages who cares very passionately about history as a public medium, but who also practices it in many different ways. So Ian, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
It's a real pleasure. Real pleasure.
Great. And Ian, you also write historical fiction under the name James Forrester. You have 3 novels out already, the wonderful Clarenceau trilogy set in Elizabethan London. And one of the things you've done probably more thoughtfully than anyone else I know of is thought about the relationship between historical fiction, the writing of historical fiction, and so-called academic history. You've written and spoken about this relationship in a number of places, and most recently in a piece called Why Historians Should Write Fiction. And I wonder if we could begin there. Can you, I've got a link to the piece on my website, but I wonder if you could also just answer that question for me now, why historians should write fiction and what kind of reaction you've gotten to the piece.
Right. Well, I've got a mixed bunch of reactions, but if I could take the things back a little bit, why historians? Well, historians is a lot of people. Why academics should write history? I think the process of academia sometimes makes us think that only objective history is good history. And I've spent a career questioning that because I think there's a great spectrum of meaningful history out there. Don't get me wrong, academia is right at the top end of what needs to be done to prove aspects of the past, to prove beyond doubt aspects of the past. Now that group should write fiction to find the limits of their knowledge. I mean, just whatever your subject, imagine walking down a street in the period you're a specialist in, and you will discover, if you try and describe it in novel form, you will discover the limits of your knowledge. And I think awareness of our limits is crucial to what we do as scholarly historians. To bring come further back along the spectrum of what historians can do, and to look at those who, perhaps through biography, mix objectivity and a certain degree of sympathy with their subject. Well, those people really need to look at the fictional as well, to discover ways of using language to create senses of drama, create light and dark in the narratives, and also to bring in the questioning of why people actually do things. So often that is not evident in the factual record, and it's great to bring in the speculation possible in history, in fiction writing, to inform history. I mean, there are a few great examples. Daughter of Town by Josephine Tay, where she speculates in fiction about why somebody might kill somebody. In this case, Richard III and the Princess of the Tower. Well, using those speculative things, you can raise the questions which don't necessarily occur to you just by looking at the factual record. So, along the spectrum of what history is, there are different reasons why people should write novels.
And has anyone reacted? Have you had any reactions from academic historians saying, "I'm never going to write a novel," but are there other ways of doing this? Or
no one's said, "Are there any other ways of doing this?" I think the majority of English academics, with whom I have the most dealings, obviously, are of the opinion, "Well, ha ha ha, that's very funny, Ian, isn't it?" We're not going to take that seriously. The people who have actually talked to me directly about it and in a constructive way are people who have actually done it. In fact, yesterday I was in London having a conversation with somebody who's a naval historian who also writes fiction, an academic naval historian who also writes fiction. And you can see in not just my case how these two genres can complement, inform, question the way you do things, and add to a richer literature at the end of it.
You say in the prologue to your book on Henry V, you make a similar observation. You say that all of your academic history in some ways has been about the nature of personality and political ambition in the Middle Ages, and that sounds like the matter of great novels. So, you know, it seems like there's already matter there that lends itself to fiction.
Yeah, I'm often asked a similar question in relation to where the idea for time travelers' guides come from. The time travelers' guides are an attempt to portray the past as if you really could go there. It is as simple as that. It's actually as complicated as that as well, because you find yourself asking questions and trying to answer with evidence questions which normally don't occur to people who just use a body of evidence in a certain way. And the easiest example to choose is smell. How do people smell differently in the past? This sense of smell. Well, there's no body of evidence going to tell you all the answers there. You have to work it out from what evidence is available to you. So the question there is something to work with. Now, for my whole career, I've been doing things like that ever since I was a child, in trying to portray the past, which is dead, not so much as lots of butterflies all pinned out in a low, like in a museum case, but the butterfly in flight. To try and get back to the past, to portray it as a living thing, even though we can't see it as a living thing, because that is the more realistic way of understanding decision-making of the past.
And you speak about complexities, irregularities, inconsistencies. So as a historian, you want to exploit those, and as a novelist, those are in some ways the matter of fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are certain things you can use. I mean, going beyond what I said previously about ways to write fiction, the themes I really was concentrating on in those novels are loyalty and betrayal, and the complexities of loyalty to your spouse, sexual loyalty, loyalty to your state, loyalty to your religion, loyalty to yourself. And all those things in the modern world are things that newspapers deal with every day, and they're not really serious subjects in themselves. Put them in the 1560s, when you can, I mean, Anabaptists were burnt for heresy still in Elizabeth's reign, and you could be hanged and drawn, quartered for disloyalty to the state. And as for disloyalty to your spouse, well, you flogged the tail of a cart through town. And not long afterwards, in the 17th century, the punishments for adultery were even worse. So these questions of loyalty become magnified by looking at the human experience that far back. It's only a few generations, it's only 12 generations, and yet history over that period can act as a lens through which we see ourselves so much more vividly and dangers so much more clearly. So yeah, I mean, it's not just complications, it's also drawing out from a history different ways of seeing ourselves.
And drawing out emotions, too. And this is something that I think in the best historical writing is open to that. And you've talked about that, about academic historians often wanting to distance themselves from the emotional content of the past. And do you think there are models for that in medieval historians, people like the Venerable Bede and Geoffrey of Monmouth, where historians writing in the Middle Ages were very attuned to that, being moved by past examples, and that's part of their method.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's funny you should mention Bede, because there is that wonderful poetic line where he talks about man's life being the bird's flight through the hall, isn't there? And it's a great analogy. Yeah. There is that sense of the poetry in the history and the poetry in your everyday life, and the richness of everyday life complementing one another. So the history is very much part of everyday life. I do think we could enrich history and see and bring history home as much richer art to the reading public if we made it much more of something that is related to people's lives today, in the sense of this can actually inform you of how rich your life is. Very much as Bede does, yeah. Right,
exactly. And I also read a lot of what you said as a teacher. And I was struck by the one thing that you didn't address in that one piece, that why historians should write novels or write fiction, is there a place, do you think, for historical fiction in the classroom, and what would it look like to make this part of how we teach the past, or should we? Do you think that would be a good idea?
I definitely think it would be a good idea. There are two things that come to mind straight away. The first is really a variation on what you were saying with emotion in the last question. I remember when I was writing The Perfect King, it was an extremely intense experience because I was writing independently. I had to cover a 50-year reign in the course of 12 months. If you're writing for a commercial publisher and you're thriving off commercial income only, then you've got to basically get the book done in the time the advance is done. So it's an extremely intense experience for me writing The Perfect King, 14 to 16 hours a day for a year, every day. But I can remember at the end coming down and sort of looking at my wife reading part of what I'd written before, and she was in floods of tears when she got to the bit where Queen Philippa dies, or died. And I suddenly thought, if I can write history that remote about somebody 600 years ago and make somebody who knows very little about this period actually weep, then surely if I've succeeded in doing something quite special, unusual for a historian, in making this really meaningful to somebody. Now, when you're talking about fiction and ideas, it would be a very good task in a classroom to try and tell people, you have all this information, you have all these fantastic stories. Can you create them, put them in such a way that they have impact, emotional impact? Because that would be one hell of a test of a student. You've got all this information, can you make it emotional? In that case, there was a very simple trick I was using, which was reminding the reader every so often of what these two people, Edward III and Philippa, had shared. And then at the end, when she dies, finally dies after a long sort of description of the death scene, then telling you all the things they've been through together. And that brings back that whole journey, and people see that whole journey, and it has some emotional impact. And I think that is a great way of testing people on what they're drawing from history. And you could do that in the classroom. Obviously, you'd have to set up a fairly sophisticated way of doing it. The other thing that occurs to me is virtual history. We've heard a lot about virtual history over the years, but I was really struck by a book that's just come out, Stephen Alford's book, The Watchers, on Elizabethan espionage network. And in the introduction to that, he has a few passages, it's a part of the introduction, where he sets up the scene where one of his assassination attempts on Queen Elizabeth succeeded, and then thinking through virtual history of what happens. And I think this is one of the best uses of virtual history I've come across, because it takes you to the moment then when people were thinking these things. Okay, we know now Elizabeth didn't get assassinated. We have that, we can't change that hindsight. But if you try and create in the classroom that sense of what would have happened if the gun had hit, then you are testing your students, you're asking them to be creative within that factual framework. And I think that would be a great way of bringing creativity, the novel writing skills into the classroom, and looking for that spark which is going to take us close to what people were thinking at the time, before they knew whether they should survive or not.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. The idea that you can take almost the husks of things and make them live again by having students interact with them in different ways.
Yes, and it also would build the writing. Now, I'm very conscious as somebody who lives entirely from the product of my pen, that there are lots of historians in the UK who don't dare do that. And we've got 3,500 professional historians in the UK, and it's a minority who actually write for a living, and it's the minority who actually write for the public. But we're teaching all these people historical skills. Most of the stories we're teaching them to produce are fantastic stories, and there could be many, many more. And I think putting across those skills of bringing across history meaningfully to the public is something also we ought to be building into the way we teach history in the Western world.
Do you think academic history is changing in that way? Maybe, if not in the UK, elsewhere? Is there more openness to emotional content and to telling stories than you've seen in the past?
I'm seeing a bit of a breakdown from what was the case 15 years ago, when there was a strict divide. And academic historians in the UK were very clear that publicising popular historians had their place, and academics had their place, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And now it's much more accepted that you will have people like myself, Mark Morris, who writes about the Middle Ages, people writing in, I can think of probably most centuries. Helen Cass is another person writing about the Middle Ages, who's got a Cambridge doctoral degree, who's done a lot of serious research, who's now writing very much for the public. There's much more crossover now, and I think the 20 or so people who are making a living that way have convinced the majority that it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. And what are you working on now? You said you gestured towards a 1,000-year history that you're writing. And what is your current project?
Well, I was meant to be writing the fifth and final volume of my medieval biography sequence, because that had an architecture to it, going from the person who got rid of Edward II through to the point at which the descendant and heir of the Mortimers became king as Edward IV. So it's going to be a biography of Richard, Duke of York. I've had to put it on hold because I'm creating a TV series based on my Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England for TV in the UK, and I hope further afield. And that's going to take me away from my desk so much. I can't work on a chronicle and account-based history while doing that. So what I suggested to my publisher is I work on an ideas book. And the idea is which century of the last 10 saw the most change.
Ah.
Because that really challenges people's conceptions of what they think change is. We talk about continuity and change an awful lot. But the public, if you ask them about change, it's always the 20th century.
Right.
And it's always the 20th century because of bombs, because of airplanes, because of mobile phones, the internet, flight, maybe computers in some cases. No one ever thinks about the nature of change, for example, in the 16th century, when man's entire conception of reality was thrown upside down, the Earth orbiting the Sun rather than vice versa, or the 14th century with the repercussions of the Black Death and the greater political movement of the nation state. Or the 11th century, which practically saw slavery eradicated in Western Europe. So, I mean, there are all these huge changes which we take for granted. And I want to write a short ideas book, which tackles these.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to seeing that.
So will I, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me and for this really wonderful conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.
All right, you bet.